ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for this OER panel today, and thank you to Leah really and Christy for putting this together. And I always want to give a shout out to the media team who's here to stream and record. So we will record this. It will be posted on probably the OER website, maybe the AOI website, a couple of things like that. So I'm Rebecca Vandevoort. I'm Assistant Vice President for Academic Outreach and Innovation, which houses the Global Campus and the Instructional Design team who's helped support this work as well. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about open education resources and why they're important. So in the fall, the president posted his goals for the year, and one of those is to grow the open source materials effort to help address student affordability concerns. So significantly, this movement has come from the students who've said course materials are too expensive and there should be other options. And it matters because the cost of textbooks is skyrocketing faster than the cost of most anything else. So between 1978 and 2014, the cost of textbooks increased 3 times faster than the consumer price index, twice the rate of new home prices, and about 25% greater than the increase in the cost of medical services. So if you look at I have a chart here I can pass around, but the cost of textbooks is increasing significantly more than a variety of other things that we purchase. And it makes a difference because it impacts student success and retention. There's a lot of literature, and Kerry is going to talk about this some with her research, that indicates that students are more frequently opting out of purchasing the textbook, trying to get through the class without the textbook, and that negatively impacts their grades. It negatively impacts time to graduation. They often will try to avoid a course that has expensive course materials. And it might interest you to know that even a $1,000 increase in the cost of college decreases the persistence to degree. For middle class and elite students, it decreases it by 9% and 3% respectively, but for poor and working class students, it decreases it by 16% and 19% respectively. So I have a lot of people who say to me, you know, textbooks are like $1,500 a year. That's nothing in comparison to tuition and room and board and all those things, but $1,000 makes a difference to students. Also, from an article, for an article in Teaching in Higher Ed, Edward Watson was interviewed about his research at the University of Georgia on OERs, and he found that grades improved at greater rates for non-white students and Pell-eligible students, and the drop-fail withdraw rates decreased more significantly for those groups as well. So moving to OERs is certainly something we can do to help those low-income students. It is really important work. It's valued by the president and the provost. It is being discussed by parents and legislators, and Washington State University is seen as a leader in this area in this state, and that's very much thanks to these individuals and several others who are moving in this direction either on their own or through the Affordable Learning Grants that were an AOI library collaborative last year. So with all of that said, through that work last year, significantly under Talia's leadership, we impacted enrollments of about 5,000 student enrollments, so not unique students, and saved students about $500,000 here on the Pullman and Global campus. There's also efforts, pretty significant efforts taking place at Vancouver. So I really want to thank the participants today, not only for being here, but for their work. We have Kate Watts in English, and my understanding is that Kate attended the Open Textbook Network workshop last year and got excited and worked with the English department and moved English 101, 201, and 301?
Just 301.
Just 301.
Just 301.
Okay.
We are chipping away at the others.
Okay, to OER. We have Maya Hutchins, COM 101, and Maya has completely created an OER and then uses that in a tool called Perusal, which increases student engagement. Kerry Cutler, who is championing the whole Department of Psych, seems to be wanting to move now in this direction following Kerry's leadership, so that's fantastic. And then our student representative to talk about the perspective from students is Colleen McMahon. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background and experiences. By way of introduction, can you talk a little bit about your background and experience with open educational resources?
Oh, starting with me. Okay. Well, hi. Again, I'm Kate Watts. I'm a senior instructor in the Department of English. I'm currently serving as the interim assistant director of composition. And I have experience both as a teacher with OERs and then also at the programmatic level. So we've had for years a sort of unwritten rule in the English department, at least in the comp program, that we were trying to keep any textbook below $50 if at all possible. We felt that it was ridiculous to ask a student to purchase a book that was any more expensive than that, especially when they're taking courses. Most of our courses, our students aren't English majors, so they're not books they're likely to keep. They're books they're likely to try to sell. And so we've also tried to keep books in rotation so that students had an opportunity to sell. But as we were working on that, a lot of us got interested in some open access sources, and one that's really commonly used in our English 101 course is a Writing Spaces book that's frequently updated. There's lots of downloadable essays. Lots of us were using them to complement the textbook that we were using in 101 as a way to have engaging material, but also not ask students to have to purchase anything in addition. And it's nice because you don't have to worry about copyright type stuff. And it's easy to get into copyright challenges when you're pulling stuff from all sorts of outside places. So I've used lots of those essays for years in my 100 level courses with success. But last spring, and it happened to coincide really nicely with attending the University of Minnesota's workshop at our libraries, the publisher announced to us that our 301 textbook would be tripling in price. For no good reason, I should also mention. Nothing had really changed. They were coming out with a new edition, but there was no significant changes to the book. And we just could not find a way to ask students to pay. I want to say it was around $128 for this book. And so we were trying to get pretty creative, and I just happened to attend the workshop. And as part of that workshop, reviewed a textbook called Rhetoric, A Literate Action, that solved a number of the problems we've been having with that course for a number of years, which there aren't a lot of 300-level rhetoric composition type textbooks available in the first place. So our options had already been limited. But this book was definitely a 300-level book. And it was an open resource, and it did the things that we needed it to do, and it did all of them for free. There was no charge to students. And so I was serving on the subcommittee that was looking for a textbook, and so all of this sort of just happened by chance that I was then able to convince, and there was a little bit of convincing, I can talk about that later, convince my colleagues that we should adopt the book at least on a trial run. And so we were wrapping up just now our first full year of using the book. So we were able to get a whole year starting in summer of last year with our textbook.
So I'm fairly new to using open resources. I'm in charge of Com 101, which is our large intro course. It's part of certification for communication. We're a large major, and it's also a social science UCore course. So we have around 750 students that come through this course in an average year. It's an interesting course in that it incorporates parts of what could be 3 standalone courses. So that makes textbooks for that course always a little bit of a challenge. So when I came to WSU, I was given this course and said, we want this to be a social science course. It hadn't been taught like that for a while, and here's sort of the things that it needs to do. And I didn't want to make students buy 3 textbooks because that seems a little ridiculous. So my first solution was I had been making a custom text with a publisher. So I was able to pull from different textbooks within their library, which kept it at around $85-ish, which was better than it could be. But I still didn't like the textbook. It still wasn't really doing what I wanted it to do. And one of the things in the courses is it's important for students to see how it's happening right now. So it's mass media and society is what it is. So it's supposed to be about why mass media matters and how we can tell, right? So I'm bringing in a lot of examples and asking them to read popular press things. And I found like I could get students to do sort of one or the other. They'd either read the textbook or they read the popular press stuff or none of the above. But it was hard for them to sort of have the experience that I wanted them to have. So when I had heard sort of vaguely of this idea that there's textbooks that are free and exist, and I was just assumed incorrectly that they were probably a poor quality. And so when I saw this grant, I was like, okay, well, I know I want to overhaul 101. I don't like what we're doing now. Maybe this is a good opportunity for me to be focused and take the time, have resources that are going to help me create something and put something together that is better. So what we ended up doing for 101 is sort of two parts, and the second part I think is the part that's actually more important to sort of the success of how it's worked in 101. The first part was essentially doing what I had been doing within publishers of making that custom textbook that's grabbing from different places, and so made that from open sources, things that were free, and so worked with Theron and his team to make it look pretty and flow nicely and all of that. And so still having that textbook, but something that's now free and is doing just as well of a job as what I had before. But what I enjoyed most and what I think is most useful is the perusal website. So this is something that's also open source, at least for now, and is a place to get students to come together and interact with these materials. So as I mentioned, it's a big class, and it's not a big class like English 101 is a big class where you have a whole bunch of sections. It's me and Todd Odd and 500 students, right? So it's sometimes hard, that you just feel like you're one in sort of a sea of many in these sorts of situations. And so with perusal, they get put in these small groups of 20 for the readings. And so they can go in and see each week what they're supposed to read. And it has the textbook chapter and then also the popular press news article sorts of things that I want them to read. So it's not that they're reading their textbook in one place and going online for this other thing. It's all in the one spot. And then they're talking with those students back and forth. They can answer questions. They get many sort of carrot points for doing these things. But I found that it super increased scores on reading questions on exams, right? So people clearly were reading it. If you'd go in and look at how people were commenting and talking back to each other, there was a lot of that happening. So it's free for them, and they're using it more, right? So all of it seems sort of a win-win for me. There were definitely hiccups involved with sort of using the software and dealing with that, but everything has a learning curve, right? And I've been very happy with how it's worked so far, so that's where I'm at.
Hi, I'm Kerry Cutler. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. I first became aware of OER when I was asked to join this university course cost reduction committee. And I went into that very much skeptical and thinking that the bookie was responsible for the escalating prices that our students were being charged, and I very quickly learned that I was wrong. I looked up my textbook on the bookie, and I looked it up on the publisher sites, and I checked on Amazon, and the bookie was actually offering the most competitive price of everybody. And so I very quickly started to understand by working on this committee that the major issue was really publishers and them dramatically increasing the cost of these textbooks. Through that, I learned of an opportunity for an OER research fellowship, and I applied for that, and I obtained it. So this is external to WSU, and it provided some funding for me to do research on OER and to attend conferences on OER. And I recently attended a conference called Open Ed, and it really hit home to me how important this movement is and how much students are really suffering as a result of the cost of these textbooks, and how much that suffering can easily be alleviated through the adoption and use of OER in our classes. I also received some funding from Academic Outreach and Innovation in order to adopt and dramatically expand upon an existing OER for one of my large-scale courses, Research Methods in Psychology. The OER that existed was not of the highest standards and quality, and I was not comfortable in using it in its current shape, so I used that funding as a partial summer stipend and spent a great deal of time doing a major overhaul of the book to make it appropriate for my course and to bring it to the standard. And I really actually enjoyed that process a lot. It's work, but it's very important, meaningful work, and it was the first time I was able to say, I disagree with that, and I do not believe that to be true, and that's an error in this textbook, and I could just delete. And I very much enjoyed doing that, and then adding in new content, or where content was just entirely lacking and missing that I felt was important, I could just add that in. So the ability to edit that book was huge for me. It gave me complete control over my course materials, which I very much enjoyed for the first time. And so I used that textbook last fall, and I'm using it this spring, and I'm doing research on the impacts of that on my students, and also in students who are taking other courses in psychology that are using OER. And I'll talk about that research. Great. Is this the time? Okay, perfect.
It's behind you, sorry, it's
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to just... okay, so for this study, this included just over 500 undergraduate students, including 7 different sections of 4 psychology classes. 2 of these classes were using OER, and 2 were using a commercial textbook. And yeah, you can go ahead and proceed. So the students in the OER and commercial textbook conditions of this study, of course there's no random assignment here, but they were equivalent in age and gender and other important characteristics. What the results of this survey showed was that 71% of the students reported having a loan from a bank or government. 52% received financial assistance from the university, 44% from their family, and the average student loan debt was over $18,000. Now, their average monthly income that they reported was $700. Now, for those who actually work, not all of them work, so I filtered that out. It's about $1,000 a month. And they reported spending an average of $450 per semester on textbooks, so roughly $1,000, right, on textbooks. So that works out to about 10% of the amount of money they're earning is going to textbooks. So students earn little, they spend a lot, and they are in a lot of debt. I asked them how the cost of textbooks has influenced them. And I know this is a lot of information. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'll just point out a few key findings here. Of course, many students are buying used textbooks to try to reduce these costs. 30%, so a third roughly, report that they've just not used a textbook, just try to get through the course without a textbook at all. 34% said they felt like they earned a poor grade as a result. 22% said that they are taking fewer classes because of this. So students really do feel the burden of textbook costs, and it's clear that they are doing their best to minimize it. So we did a few comparisons looking at, how often did they report reading the text? And we actually found, I thought that maybe some cognitive dissonance would be at play, and maybe they would read a commercial, expensive textbook they spent a lot of money on more. No, they actually reported, the OER students reported reading the textbook more. And they also felt that the OER textbook was more useful in that it helped them to answer quiz questions, exam questions, and assignment questions more than the traditional textbook. And I do think that part of this is a result of that editing process that goes on, is that the textbook becomes so much closer to my materials, my exams, my assignments, and therefore becomes a much more useful resource to them. I asked them to rate the quality of the text and the fair price of the texts. Again, looking at OER versus commercial, and we found that the OER texts were actually rated higher quality, and the students thought that they were worth more money than the commercial texts that we were using. These are rather surprising findings to me. I'm a psychologist, and I study stress, so I wanted to know about their stress. And they were significantly less stressed, the students in the OER condition. I mean, that financial impact is a stressor on students, and that stress has all sorts of detrimental effects, of course. Any way we can reduce their stress levels and help them be able to focus on their schoolwork, I think, is important. One more, sorry. That's okay. And then I just asked them, how likely would you be to take another course using OER? You can see that students, by and large, want to take courses with OER, and of course those who had that experience wanted to continue to take more courses using OER. So just to summarize here, our students earn very little money, they spend a lot of money on textbooks, and they have a lot of debt. And of course publishers don't do a whole lot, but they earn a lot of money charging our students high prices. So the question I pose is therefore, who would you rather support, our students or these publishers? Students feel the impact of textbook prices, and they are doing their best to reduce it. And so shouldn't we help them in those efforts? Students spent more time reading the OER. They found it more useful. They perceived it to be higher quality and worth more money. So again, isn't it our responsibility to provide high quality resources for our students? Students want to take more classes using OER, so let's make them available. Thanks.
Can you clarify, were these OER section versus commercial textbook section,
Yes.
or class versus class? So it was, you had...
Okay, so, sorry, sections
so
versus class.
like Psych 312, was that entirely OER, and you're comparing to another psych class that had a text?
There's a mix, actually, so it's a little bit of each. If you go back to the first slide, that might help me tease some of that out for you. Here we go. Okay, so some of the commercial condition is an entirely different course than an OER condition, but there are cases within there as well where it's the same course, but one section is using OER and the other is using commercial. A lot of this is cross-course comparisons, but because we have a total of 4 different classes and 7 sections of those classes, there shouldn't be too much systematic bias in those students, and almost all of these are 300-level courses as well.
Okay. Thank you. All right. And Colleen.
Perfect. So my name is Colleen. I currently serve as the Director of University Affairs for ASWSU, which is the Associated Students of Washington State University, so our student government here in WSU Pullman. And I've been in a really kind of cool spot the last 2 years where I served as the liaison between students and the administration. And so OER came actually aware to me my freshman year here. So I've served on ASWSU my full 4 years. I'm a senior graduating in May. And textbook cost is something that we've always wanted to reduce. We're very well aware of. We're talking to students, they're saying they had to buy textbooks and they had to go, they had to forego buying food or maybe paying their rent late, and different things like this. Drastic differences that maybe you don't hear every day, but they are happening a lot more commonly than we thought. And also the thing about textbooks too that are really interesting is that you don't really get to budget for them. So you get to your first day of classes, your textbooks may be $500 for the semester, or they may be $1,000, and you don't really get to plan for that. So whereas your rent, it's the same every month. You sign a lease, months before. You get to budget your tuition, months before. You have your financial aid all planned out. Your textbooks, you don't know if you're going to have to pay $300 in an access code or $50 for a textbook until the first day of classes. And so that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of the problem, as well as obviously the cost of it. And so I get to be in a really cool position where I'm this liaison and where I get to connect the students who, obviously want all of their textbooks for free, and then these professors who are worried about the effort of putting it, they have a lot of time constraints already, putting a lot of effort into their classes, and so converting their classes to OER. The quality of it is a big issue that a lot of people are worried about, the feasibility, all these different things. And so I've gotten to be in this really cool position where I kind of am the liaison between it, and I'm trying to mesh those. So, okay, what classes can we make OER? Where is it possible? Where is it going to impact the most students? Things like that. And other things outside of it that people don't necessarily think impacting it. So a huge thing that we've seen where a lot of costs are going are actually quick response tools. So like Top Hat, iClicker, things like that. And so we have students buying Top Hat, iClicker, Reef Polling. The list goes on and on and on every single semester, and they're buying one semester worth. All of a sudden, they're spending $300 on 3 different systems that are doing the same thing. And then they go the next semester and they're using something else. And so we're actually finding out that our Wi-Fi isn't that great all around campus. Okay, so where can we get funding to up our Wi-Fi so we can use, maybe a free product or a cheaper product or make it the same for the university. So different things like that. Also within ASWSU, we've actually been able to give some of our funding for ASWSU back to OER grants to help people or help professors convert their classes to OER. So we actually gave some money for those grants as well, which is really cool. And so, just kind of that middleman, and I've been really heavily involved in this, especially the last 2 years, but kind of figuring out the logistics of everything else besides converting the classes to OER.
Great, thank you. So Talia suggested that maybe we should define OER, and she might need to help me a little bit with this, but basically open educational resources, that's OER, and they are resources that are freely available online. They are generally licensed using the Creative Commons licensing. So it could be CC BY, which is the most open. It could be CCNC. Yeah, there's 6 of them. And so they kind of go through different levels. So CC BY, which is what we recommend at the university, you can adopt other people's materials. You can, as Kerry talked about, adopt something and then adapt it. So at some of the other license levels, you maybe can adopt but not adapt. So anyway, there are materials that can be adopted, adapted, reused, remixed, repurposed. Yeah, freely available online. And they're also generally available in hard copy, print copy, look very much like a traditional text often, but you can really consider YouTube videos or TED Talks, those kinds of things that are openly available and licensed to be allowed to be reused are considered open educational resources. So Talia's got a couple texts here if anybody wants to look at those. And I think we're going to go on with our questions now. So Maya, Kerry, and Kate all went through the process of replacing a traditional text with the open resources. So talk a little more in detail what that process was like, how much work it was, and where you found your resources, where and how you found your resources. That's the question I get a lot. Well, I don't know where to look.
Sure. So because we were already working to look for a textbook to adopt, it was actually pretty similar to the same work we would have done. We were reviewing a handful of textbooks already in a subcommittee. There were, I want to say, 5 of us who teach the course regularly. We were displeased with what we were seeing, both cost-wise and quality-wise. It was the books were not of sufficient quality or content for our purposes. And so the book I suggested is from the University of Minnesota's Open Resources Library. It was, in that particular library, the only book that met the requirements for the course, and we reviewed it like we would any other textbook. There was a little bit of pushback from colleagues who initially were worried about a lot of the misinformation that surrounds OERs. They thought it would be poor quality. They thought it will be old. That was the number one thing. If it's free, it must be a decade or more old, and that was not the case. It was an 18-month-old book, and things in rhetoric don't change that fast, so we're okay. And so then as committee members reviewed the book and put it through its paces, they were pleased with what we saw. We agreed to adopt it for summer. Trial ran it with the summer session of the course, asked students for feedback on the book. Students generally very similar to the kinds of things the rest of the panelists are saying. Students found the book easy to use. They engaged with it more than they would have otherwise. Teachers found it easy to use, were able to use it in class as they would any other book. So similar process in terms of textbook adoption.
So I just checked the Open Textbook Network, and I found one for the research methods class that I teach. And I looked at that, and I was not terribly delighted with it. And I contacted a friend of mine from graduate school, so someone I went to grad school with. And he's a huge proponent in the OER community up in British Columbia, where this is a big movement there. And I just directly asked him, are you aware of any other ones? And he had actually adapted that textbook and Canadianized it. And there was a Canadian edition. And then that Canadian edition was reverted back to an American edition by somebody else I went to grad school with, oddly enough. And so I got that re-Americanized version. And then I adapted that version. I was much happier with that version. They had done quite a bit of work improving on the existing one already. But I still saw a lot of room for improvement. And so over the summer, which is a nice time to do this, I spent, I would say, a solid month of work heavily editing that book, just going through line by line and page by page. I've been teaching research methods for over a decade, and I've published a research methods small book with a small publisher. And so I have a lot of expertise in the area. It was very easy for me, honestly, to go in and know what concepts needed to be added and exactly how to add those. And have used varieties of examples. And so it was not a difficult process. It was slightly time consuming, but all in all, a pleasurable process. What was the second part of the question? Was that it? How did I find it, and what did I do?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Perfect.
So for me, work-wise, I would say it was pretty similar, right? So I had already been I had been creating books like this for a while now. Just now I was using resources that were free rather than a catalog. So there's, I went to Minnesota. I've used the search tool where you can go in and see everything that's open source. So it took time, but for the type of course that I'm teaching where it is being constantly updated, we talk about social media. If I have references to MySpace, I'm old and my students aren't going to pay attention, right? So it's already something that has sort of a lot of upkeep built into it. So it was just switching where I was looking. And the stuff that's on media history, I'm never going to have to touch that, and it will be old and it's okay. So I know where I have to pay attention to and keep updating versus the parts that can just sort of exist and be fine. So, yeah. Yay, internet.
Okay, great, thanks. So some of this as I ask these questions, some of this you might have spoken to, so if you have additional comments or thoughts, compared to the courses when you taught them using the traditional textbook, are there other things you've noticed about using OER in the classroom that faculty might want to be aware of?
Because we use a common textbook for each of our composition courses, it was nice to adopt something that was so readily accessible. So if somebody is out somewhere else, working there on sabbatical or they're elsewhere, it was very easy to, one, get the textbook to them. Two, our instructors and our graduate students, when they teach these courses, they have a lot of flexibility in terms of the assignments that they create. And so I think everybody was pretty pleasantly surprised to see that the book, just like any other textbook, they could easily use what they wanted to use and not use what they didn't like so much. Our particular textbook has one of the more closed, what is the word I'm looking for? The licensing is one of the more closed options. So it's not one that can be edited in that way, but they don't feel bad if they don't assign chapter 5, for example, because they didn't ask the students to pay for it. So they can use as much or as little without any damage being done that way. And then I'd say otherwise it's been pretty similar to using any other textbook. Students are, they can view it on their phone, their tablet, their laptop. If they don't bring those items to class with them, just like any other textbook, you can pop it up on a screen if you really need a particular passage or an example from a page. It's been pretty easy to use, really.
Some of the surprising benefits, I guess, the first day of class when I told them we would be using this free online textbook, they applauded. There was a lineup after the first day of class of people thanking me and shaking my hand, which was very meaningful to me. Again, the students really did perceive a lot more overlap between the lecture material and the textbook material, and they really enjoyed that, and they appreciated it, and they liked it. They felt a little bit less overwhelmed, I think, by all the different sort of random things that a random textbook can throw at them that, might not be as important to us. I could edit those things out. I don't know if last semester I just had an amazing cohort of students, but they were so engaged, and they really asked meaningful questions, even in a large class size, which is not always super common. And they just really seemed to get stuff very, very quickly. And they did exceptionally well. And again, I don't know if that was just a sort of a random cohort or if the OER was related to that. And I imagine it was both. Imagine I had a strong group who really benefited from that.
I mean, the biggest thing that I already mentioned was they used it, right? I could tell that they used it more. And that was helpful in a variety of ways, both for them and for me. So that, seems like a pretty good thing.
Okay. Any other benefits or challenges you'd like to speak to?
In my 10 years of teaching, I've never won a teaching award, and I just got the Student Choice Award for Best Professor at WSU. And I do credit some of that to OER. I think the students very much appreciated that. Mm-hmm.
I think a challenge will be paying attention to the licenses and how much you can edit and not edit. Because as you guys are talking about that, I'm like, I did so not pay attention to that. So in a year, probably, when I'm going to need to go in and change things, can I just change it myself, or am I going to have to find an updated version? So we'll see. we'll see what happens there. But I think that's a challenge that even as someone who is using it, I didn't really think about. So.
Especially in our 300 and I've proposed it in a 400 level class because the particular book we used it's the by NCND, so there's less you can do with that particular licensing. There's a couple of sticky places where the textbooks, they all say the same thing. It's about propaganda, and the students always push back against it, rightfully so. They're right. And in the past, I've been like, well, great, let's rewrite that section of the textbook. Let's do that as an assignment. What do you think it should say? Let's figure that out. And I was like, man, I want to stick that in this textbook. But we can't do that. So there's been that kind of, how will we navigate it, especially in those upper division courses where you hope students are challenging it. And if it were my book, I'd be like, great, let's insert it. So sometimes it's a little bit frustrating to them that they can't actually make the change, if that makes sense.
And Colleen, I'm curious, we talk a lot about the benefits to students, but do you ever hear negatives? Are there challenges? Are there things faculty might want to be aware of from the student perspective as they're developing these?
No, I really don't see a lot of challenges or negatives from a student perspective. Honestly, I just see a bunch of small positives. For example, my professor told me to bring my 20-pound textbook to class and no one brought it. And she was like, why didn't anyone bring it? And I was like, 20 pounds on my back is really a lot. And so I think, too, there's a lot of different things that are still way behind in technology where OERs are way ahead and other ones. So I really don't see a lot of those negatives. I see a lot of positives. I think a lot of the negative connotations really come with implementation and from the professor side of it. And I think from the student side, I think it's all smooth sailing. I think it's more available. More students are going to be involved because all of your students can access it instead of only a portion of it, just because a lot of students are skipping out on a book, especially due to price. And so I don't really see any negatives to OER, as long as the quality is there. Obviously, I think that's the biggest thing. And I think the professors are doing their due diligence with that to make sure that the quality of their textbook is there, and they're putting in the work to make sure that everything is up to date and to the same quality of their commercial textbook.
Okay, great. So speaking of students, one of the advantages, if you read the literature of OERs, is that students can be invited as co-creators. Open licensing means that students can annotate course materials or help to add to them over time. Do you have experiences with using OERs to encourage student engagement in class and in helping to create the materials?
For me with Perusal, it was great, right? That's the whole sort of purpose of that tool. And with 400 students, it is then overwhelming to take a look at all of their annotations to maybe meaningfully incorporate them. But it was definitely something that increased engagement. And I would highly recommend the use of that tool for anybody that hasn't. I found it helped a lot.
And will you use their annotations to update or make modifications? Or?
I need to take a look at the license and see whether or not I can. So, yeah.
For some time, I've done study sessions where students submit multiple choice questions of their own and provide an answer, and then we go through these the day before the exam. Well, it's not been formalized. My plan is to try to actually formalize that and create a study guide and test bank for the textbook that's going to be student generated for this course and another course that I would like to move to OER for in order to have them sort of contribute to the process.
So I already mentioned that our particular textbook for 301 has some challenges because of its particular licensing. But as I was kind of rummaging through my notes to prepare for today, I had this idea of, we also have a similar problem in our 201 class where the books that we have encountered they're not really quite what we would want for the class. And I was like, we should just write the chapters with the students. And I was like, why have I not done this before? And it wasn't really until I encountered this process that I thought, not all of the textbooks in the library are full textbooks, right? Some of them are small sort of handbook type things, or some of them are really just a chapter on a particular topic. And I was like, we could write the chapter on doing primary research at Washington State University libraries. We could, at least from a student perspective, start to generate that, and we could call on librarians to help us. And so now I have this crazy idea to do that next time I teach the class. So check back in with me and see how it goes.
So one of the other concerns I hear a lot is, and you guys have kind of spoken to it, that there's a perception that because they're free, they're not of good quality. And I know that you can, in many cases, adapt them and upgrade the quality. But overall, based on what you looked at and considered, would you say?
I would say it's totally a rumor. At least the ones that I looked at. And I had that same perception going into it. Because again, the idea, well, if it's free, it must be horribly out of date. And that wasn't the case at all with the texts that I looked at. They were just as well produced. The graphics, the discussion questions at the end of the chapter, all of that was just as good as a commercial text.
I think it varies. I think it really does vary. I think that there's very high quality OERs out there. I think there are very low quality OERs out there, and I think there's moderate quality, just like there is for textbooks. I clearly showed data that suggests that the students perceive these to be actually significantly higher quality than the traditional textbooks that we're using, and some of those textbooks that we're using are in their 7th, 8th, 9th edition. So, and we're comparing those textbooks against OERs that have just been created and are sort of hot off the presses, so to speak, or just been adapted and modified. So yeah, I think it varies, and I think that we can, when it's not the highest of quality, we can easily bring it up to that standard in a short period of time. I mean, 1 month is not a ton of time to work on a textbook.
And what I sort of found, I agree with both of you. Many of the myths were debunked simply by engaging with the materials. But to Kerry's point, there was a wide range of quality as well. But it was kind of like any other textbook where I was like, well, we could use the chapter from here, but since I'm not asking students to buy a book, I can also just use the chapter from here. And since many of them are downloadable as a PDF, it's not any different than giving my students a handful of PDFs on Blackboard, the same way I would house them in a readings folder anyway. And so instead of asking them to buy 2 or 3 books, I could simply grab the chapters that I thought were quality from other books if I didn't or couldn't spend the time to do the revision work. There was a lot of freedom simply in not asking students to spend money for them. I didn't feel guilty picking and choosing materials that I liked or didn't like.
And I think to build on that too, I think kind of the thought that like commercial textbooks are of this really high quality. I think that's kind of the myth if we're being entirely honest. As a student, I can't tell you one. I've actually never had a class that's OER. I've only had the interaction from my ASWSU student perception, not from a student using OER. But I can tell you from all of my classes, for all my commercial textbooks, I can't pinpoint one of them where I was like, this is a really, really good textbook. Like I am learning, I am reading through it. Like this is flowing really smoothly. And so I think that's something to kind of think about as well is, okay, what are your commercial textbooks really kind of doing for you and your students, and what's really the engagement there? Because I think what you have with OERs and something that's really unique is you get that engagement because all of your students are going to be buying, or they have access to that textbook. You can pick and choose and different things like that. And once again, you don't feel guilty for saying a chapter here, a chapter here, a chapter here, a chapter here, and then this. And so you can kind of mix it around and include all these other things or add your own, or, if you're able to delete things, things like that. And so I think that's kind of another way to look at it is I guess, what are your commercial textbooks? What really is your engagement with your commercial textbooks? Because like I said, as a student, I barely pick up any of my textbooks. I've bought $300 textbooks, and I'm actually a student who I actually have stopped buying the textbooks at this point, just because I may pick it up before a test, but is it really worth spending $300 to maybe look at a few points? I mean, most of my textbooks, I'm like, okay, here's a bolded section, 3 sentences other, skip, 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 bolded section. And so just another way to think about it as well.
And to follow up on what you've said there, I've reviewed a ton of statistics textbooks, and the absolute best one that I've ever been able to find, we found 2 full pages of errors. On this page there's this error, on this page there's this error. And with students, we generated and identified all of these errors, and then we sent them to the publisher. Well, we're 3 editions past that, and all of those errors are still in this 10th and final edition of that textbook, all of them. And I can't just click delete.
Before we go on with our structured questions, I'm just wondering, I don't know if we have anyone at a distance, Amina. Any questions for the panel? Okay, so I'm going to skip the cost question. I think we've talked about that quite a bit. So the last one really is, what's your advice for those who might be considering going to OER?
Dive in, check it out. I think a lot of misperceptions are that misperceptions. And so I would disagree that 1 month of work is not that much work. But as research faculty, like, I am super protective of my summertime. Like, that is, if I am not using my summer for research, then I'm going to have a real rough school year. But you can slowly chunk at it, right? Like, you don't have to do it all at once. You can make sort of these baby steps to do it. You're going to, hopefully you're spending time improving your courses anyways. So why not start looking at making those improvements through OERs rather than commercial texts?
Yeah, that is something I've seen from a lot of other people. It seemed like they were gradually adding more and more online materials anyway, and then finally got to the point where they may not need the textbook, but for a while they probably were using both.
That's essentially what we've done in our 402 technical writing class. Technical writing is one of those things in English that does change rapidly. It changes very quickly. The books in that genre tend to run well over $100. And even if a student wanted to keep it for whatever reason, it makes no sense to keep it because it will be outdated in 2 or 3 years. Anyway, and so more and more instructors have gone to YouTube and other just web sources that there's no access problem with, a lot of us are doing that work anyway. We're making that leap using resources outside of our textbooks, so I think if people are willing to think of it sort of that way, you're doing that work in a lot of ways in your classes, whether you're bringing it to class to show it to students or you're assigning it to them outside of class time to engage with. This is similar. If you want to adopt one of the textbooks or work with one, it's no different than the things a lot of us are doing already.
And I would suggest that faculty talk to their students and ask their students about the impact that this textbook that they've assigned has had on those students. And I think the answers the students will give will probably compel faculty enough. I think it's something that a lot of faculty maybe just don't think enough about, Part of our job is to find a textbook, to create these materials, to go up, to deliver them, and I don't know that we always think of the impact that we're having on our students positively or negatively through the textbook choices that we make. We just sort of assume, well, this is just one of the costs associated with going to university, and students just expect these costs. But I think that they should listen to the students, and they should listen to the impact that these exorbitantly priced textbooks are having on students, and asking them, what would you do with this money if you didn't have to pay for that textbook? This was something that was in the survey that was qualitative. I didn't have much time to code, but I certainly looked through it. And I mean, almost all of it was to buy food and to pay rent and to put it towards other university costs. And I think 2 out of 500 students said that they would buy weed with it. My attention was drawn to that because I study weed. But, it was very responsible use of the money, very responsible use of the money.
Yeah, I think getting student feedback is the biggest thing before you're thinking about transitioning to OER. I mean, even asking your students, okay, what part of your textbook are you even using? Because I haven't had very many professors that ask me that, and they'd probably be surprised to find out that I'm not using much of it. And I also think, too, not to underestimate any work that you do, how much that impacts a student. I think sometimes we think that we have to go from 0 to 100. So if your textbook costs $300, like the next step would have to be to a zero-cost OER. But I think if you were able to reduce it in any manner is really, really important. So maybe you have 2 textbooks, you cut one of those textbooks, or maybe you don't use an access code, you find another resource, or a classroom response tool, and you reduce that cost. You may not get a standing ovation at the end of your class just because there may still be some cost, but I think it's important to know that that still is impacting your students greatly. If you're saving them $30 or $10, $15, $100, regardless of how much you're saving them, is impacting the students, and you are increasing their engagement in class and their accessibility. Just because I think we're in this captive market, and professors and students are both in that captive market, and it's just kind of sometimes you throw your hands up and you're like, I'm in this captive market, and so we just have to do what we do with textbooks. But I think anything that anyone can do to chip away at that is really important, and that's how we're going to make those big strides, is by those little strides that everyone's making. And so I think everyone kind of has some kind of involvement with OER, and kind of finding where your involvement at is really important.
Great. Any last minute thoughts? Well, thank you so much for being here and speaking to this issue and to jumping in and saving students money. That's a great thing, and we want to keep doing it. The RFP for affordable learning grants closed March 1st. The president and the provost and the student government all funded that initiative. So there's 11 faculty who have applied for those. We'll be reviewing those applications soon, and hope just to see this continue to grow.
Thanks for that funding to make that possible and to make those transitions a little bit easier and less burdensome.
We're happy to do it, aren't we, Talia? All right, thank you.
Thank you.